There was a time when the soldiers of MACV-SOG believed their unit represented the pinnacle of covert operations. Operating deep reconnaissance missions into Laos, Cambodia, and the DMZ, these six-man teams moved with suppressed weapons and possessed the skills to vanish and strike with precision. Their reputation as shadows seemed well earned until circumstances led to a joint operation with an Australian SAS patrol that would fundamentally challenge every assumption about what true stealth and mastery actually meant. The initial meeting took place at a forward base outside Da Nang. There were no formal salutes or unnecessary conversation, only 5 men wearing tattered uniforms with faces that appeared carved from stone. Their gear looked remarkably sparse by American standards, with no extra pouches visible, no apparent radios, and no visible rank insignia. One of the Australians briefly glanced at the MACV-SOG team, offered a single nod, and then returned his attention to checking his canteen. The absence of introductions and small talk created a heavy silence that suggested these men had already mentally begun the mission, while the Americans were somehow late to catch up. The patrol commenced at dawn. The jungle atmosphere was thick with moisture, and the air already saturated with oppressive heat. The SOG team maintained their standard formation with weapons at the ready and eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Every 30 minutes brought the routine pause to check bearings, transmit quiet radio signals, and confirm positions. The Australians, however, operated differently. They spoke no words and made no stops. Then, approximately 4 hours into the patrol, a disturbing realization occurred. The Australian contingent had completely disappeared. There had been no audible footsteps, no snapping branches, no trace of their passage. They had simply slipped away like smoke. A brief moment of concern arose among the SOG team. Initial thoughts suggested the Australians might have been lost or had broken contact. However, upon reaching the designated rendezvous point, the Australian patrol was already present, already positioned defensively, and watching the approaching Americans as though they had been waiting for an extended period. This moment brought a profound realization. While the Americans had considered themselves ghosts, the Australians demonstrated what true invisibility actually meant. Both units were supposedly elite reconnaissance forces, hardened by months operating in hostile environments and trusted with missions requiring complete independence and exceptional mental fortitude. On paper, MACV-SOG and the Australian SAS appeared as equals, brothers in arms, despite serving under different flags. The assumption had been that both groups were ghosts in the jungle. That belief persisted until observation of the Australian operational methods revealed how significant the differences actually were. The American team moved with a developed rhythm, having built their routine through dozens of missions with established spacing, silent hand signals, and scheduled radio check-ins every 30 minutes. Each soldier carried over 60 pounds of equipment, including communications gear, claymore mines, extra magazines, maps, morphine, spare batteries, and other essential items. While lean compared to standard infantry, the load remained substantial. The Australians appeared to have stepped out of an entirely different conflict. Their equipment had been stripped to absolute essentials, with minimal gear, no visible radios, no unnecessary conversation, no backward glances to verify spacing, just a slow, deliberate advance that moved like a single organism rather than individual squad members. The Australian patrol did not stop when the Americans stopped. They did not rest when the Americans rested. They simply continued moving with quiet, intentional purpose, always ahead and always just beyond visual range. When the American team caught up at rest points, the Australians were already positioned in defensive crouches, facing outward with weapons ready. No words were spoken. Their breathing remained calm and controlled. When inquiry was made about concerns about falling out of synchronization without communications, one Australian operator simply looked for a moment before responding that they rehearsed until talking became unnecessary. This approach proved revelatory. SOG operations relied heavily on technology, encrypted radios, signal mirrors, PRC-25 systems with backup batteries. The fundamental trust existed that if situations deteriorated, extraction or gunship support could be requested. The SAS operated without such dependencies. Their communications specialist carried no visible handset, only a folded message card with the simple principle that if the patrol failed to return, someone would eventually locate the message. This was not bravado, but pure practical calculation. Their entire operational doctrine centered on avoiding detection, eliminating the need for backup, and engaging only when necessary. The Americans had been trained for speed, breaking contact, striking hard, and withdrawing cleanly. The Australians had been trained to disappear completely. Over time, this difference began to affect the American team. Not negatively, but through a humbling process. The realization settled that they were not the quietest operators in the jungle, not by a considerable margin. One team member quietly observed on the second day that the Australians appeared to be hunting ghosts, while the Americans were leaving tracks. This assessment felt accurate. Despite operating in the same jungle on the same mission, somewhere in their development, the Australians had stopped trying to master the terrain and had simply become part of it. The Americans remained visitors, armed, capable, deadly, but fundamentally visible. The Australians were not. The pivotal moment arrived on the afternoon of the first full operational day. The jungle heat was oppressive, causing uniforms to cling and weapons to feel considerably heavier. The SOG team had halted briefly to adjust bearings and transmit a low-car radio burst back to base, following standard procedure that had been executed hundreds of times previously. The team performed efficiently, silently, and professionally. However, during this brief pause, an unsettling realization occurred. The Australians had vanished. They were not ahead, not behind, not on the flanks. They had simply ceased to be present. Initial assumptions suggested they had maneuvered around to take point position, perhaps finding a superior route through the dense vegetation, or advancing at a different pace. However, scanning the surrounding trees revealed no sign whatsoever of their passage. No disturbed vines, no bent stalks of elephant grass, no shifting shadows. The jungle stood in perfect stillness. This created a peculiar sensation, being surrounded by a silence that did not belong to the American team. Quiet concern spread among the team members. Losing track of a partner patrol in deep enemy territory represented more than unprofessional conduct. It posed genuine danger. If hostile contact occurred, exact knowledge of Allied positions became critical. Even a single misplaced shot could result in friendly casualties. If the Australians had been compromised, some indication should have been audible, movement, sounds of struggle, or weapons fire. But there was nothing. The American team advanced more cautiously, carefully scanning the ground for any trace. After another hour of slow, deliberate movement, they reached the designated observation point overlooking a narrow trail known to be used by North Vietnamese army forces. The full extent of the situation became apparent at that location. The Australian patrol was already established, already camouflaged, already observing the trail through carefully concealed positions in the vegetation. One Australian raised a finger to his lips without even turning fully toward the approaching Americans. The gesture appeared effortless, quiet, disciplined, and natural, as though reminding children not to disturb a sleeping infant.
The Americans froze in place, genuinely stunned. How had the Australians reached the position ahead of schedule? How had they moved past without producing any sound? How had 5 men carrying rifles and packs navigated through some of the noisiest terrain in Southeast Asia without disturbing even a single leaf? Moving carefully into position beside the Australian patrol leader, a quiet inquiry was made about their arrival time. Without looking, without smiling, the response came in an almost bored tone that they had arrived before the Americans started their radio check. That represented the precise moment of understanding that reconnaissance had been approached incorrectly all along. Not in an unsafe or ineffective manner, but with excessive noise, predictable patterns, and reliance on tools instead of instincts. The previous understanding had been that silence meant not talking. The Australians demonstrated that silence meant not existing. From that moment forward, every operational assumption felt lighter, as though something could be set down and completely relearned. The truth had become clear. This was not a study of the SAS. This was observation of what true mastery looked like. The training had emphasized that radios represented lifelines. Without them, units became isolated and vulnerable. In MACV-SOG, the entire mission framework depended on communications. Silent burst transmissions every 30 minutes, emergency frequencies, encrypted codes memorized and rehearsed before every operation. If a soldier went down, the first response involved activating the radio. Continuous observation of the Australians waited for one of them to break silence with a quiet transmission, perhaps a whisper into a throat microphone or a signal check. This never occurred. They did not speak, they did not signal. They simply moved wordlessly, fluidly, and in perfect synchronization, like a school of fish responding to the same invisible current. Initial assumptions suggested the Australians possessed some advanced field communications equipment not yet observed. However, later inquiry with their communications specialist revealed only a tap on his chest pouch and mention of a message card. The explanation was straightforward. If circumstances deteriorated badly, someone would eventually find it. If they did not find it, then knowledge of the patrol was unnecessary. This was not fatalism, but preparation. The plan was not to require rescue. The plan was to avoid detection entirely. Their coordination emerged from repetition, from shared instinct, from a type of drilled cohesion that seemed foreign to most American units. Training occurred at high intensity, certainly, but American forces also trusted their equipment. The Australians trained until they could execute entire missions without sight, without sound, without verbal communication, and still position themselves exactly where needed at precisely the right moment. At one point, the SOG team leader quietly questioned how the Australians were communicating. The answer became apparent through observation. Communication occurred through weight shifts, finger placement along rifle barrels, and blinks held 1 second longer than normal. Their entire system relied on pre-mission rehearsal and battlefield intuition. Speech became unnecessary because every scenario had already been thoroughly walked through before entering the jungle. They did not pause to consult maps or compasses. The patrol leader would simply glance at a tree, a rock, or a slope of earth and adjust course by a few degrees. No words were spoken. No confirmation was needed. The rest of the team followed without hesitation. They appeared tethered by an invisible thread, with each man perfectly aware of the next position. When they stopped, the halt was instantaneous. No staggered stops, no domino effect of men catching up. When one froze, all froze. Nothing like this had been witnessed before. The Americans moved well. The Australians moved like wind. All of this occurred without a single radio transmission, not even a whisper. That night, back at the temporary observation post, conversation occurred with the Australian patrol leader regarding concerns about operating without communications in case of problems. The response came gently but firmly. If something goes wrong, the situation either gets resolved silently or the patrol was never meant to be in that location. No ego colored the voice, no arrogance, just calm certainty. In that moment, the understanding crystallized that the Australians were not merely proficient at operating without noise. Silence formed an integral part of their doctrine. For the first time, questions arose about whether the entire American approach to combat had been built on a foundation of noise, while the Australian approach had been built on its absence. The following day brought surveillance of a suspected NVA supply route. Intelligence suggested small convoys moved through twice weekly, usually unguarded, transporting ammunition, rice, or documents under the jungle canopy. The mission parameters specified observation only, verify trail usage, estimate strength, mark timings, with no contact and no gunfire. For the American team, this meant establishing a temporary observation post, maintaining watch for 24 hours, then withdrawing with collected intelligence. Best case scenario involved observing a handful of runners or a bicycle convoy. Worst case involved mortar fire. The SAS employed a different approach. They scouted the area the previous night, then positioned themselves before first light. Rather than observing from a distance, they moved so close to the trail that locating them proved difficult even with knowledge of their approximate positions. One operator had positioned himself under a rotted log, lying perfectly motionless, with only his eyes visible through a layer of wet leaves. Another had blended into a mud bank, remaining motionless for hours. Observation of their work prompted the thought that this transcended reconnaissance. This was predation. When the NVA runners finally appeared, a line of 5 men carrying crates and a rusted bicycle, the SAS did not raise their rifles. They did not shift position. They did not even blink. They simply watched, allowed the enemy to pass, memorized their faces, noted foot patterns, assessed the weight of cargo, observed the rhythm of their stride, and vanished. By the time both units regrouped that night, the SAS had compiled a comprehensive sketch of enemy movement, including cargo weight estimates, belt buckle details, and even markings on rice sacks, all collected without a sound and without pulling a single trigger. When extraction time arrived, the American team began their standard withdrawal procedure, careful but hurried, attempting to erase traces by brushing back branches and smoothing footprints. The Australians moved as though they had never been present. They had walked on roots, crawled over rocks, and padded silently through creek beds. Every resting point had been cleaned. Every pressure mark in mud had been covered. Even expectorum had been buried. When passing back over the trail, locating their setup positions proved impossible. The effect was eerie. When inquiry was made about this meticulous approach, the answer came simply: if the enemy finds a trail, they follow it. Therefore, no trail should be left. That single sentence encapsulated their entire doctrine. SAS operations often functioned under the assumption that sufficient speed and sufficient force enabled clean escape. The safety net was speed and violence. For the Australians, the safety net was invisibility, not merely visual, but environmental, psychological, even emotional. Extended consideration revealed something that settled heavily. They did not avoid firefights out of fear. They avoided them because such engagements were unnecessary. The enemy cannot fight what it does not know exists.
No one joins MACV-SOG by accident. The path requires selection, screening, extreme pressure, breakdown, and reconstruction. Operations occur in teams where failure means death and where performance on the worst day still needs to meet standards. By deployment time, soldiers have become more than combatants. They're problem solvers, ghosts, survivors. Acknowledging that someone else might execute the same mission with greater proficiency proves difficult. It cuts deeply. That precise feeling emerged after 3 days operating in the bush alongside the Australian SAS. Not envy, not rivalry, just a creeping, quiet humility, comparable to realizing one has been speaking loudly in a library for one's entire life without anyone mentioning it until now. Initially, the differences appeared merely stylistic. The Australians moved slower and packed lighter. They operated more quietly, with greater patience. This was attributed to national doctrine, personality, perhaps even arrogance. However, by the conclusion of that joint mission, denial became impossible. They were simply operating on a higher plane of discipline. They did not appear tougher. They did not boast. They simply made fewer mistakes. Their presence in the jungle could be measured in grams and decibels, not bravado or equipment quantity. While the American team radioed updates, confirmed grid coordinates, and whispered over maps, the Australians relied on muscle memory and silent trust. The admission came with difficulty. One team member, a veteran of 2 tours and dozens of reconnaissance insertions, muttered during a rest halt that they had been loud throughout their entire careers.
This was not self-pity, but revelation. The Australians were not showing off. They were not attempting to make the Americans appear inferior. They never once corrected or commented on American operational methods. They simply moved the way they had always moved, as though they had become part of the jungle itself. The Americans began to feel exposed, not through words, but through example. By the fourth day, modifications began. Gear loads were reduced, radio transmissions were skipped, and spacing became more deliberate. Cues were taken from how the Australians crouched low during rainfall, how they masked their scent, how they kept even their blinks slow and measured. Speaking decreased, while observation increased. Strangely, the jungle began to feel different, not less dangerous, just less reactive. The focus shifted from pushing through to blending in. That night, conversation occurred with one of their sergeants, an older man with quiet eyes like stone. Inquiry was made about the time required to develop such movement capability. His response came with a shrug. It takes time to stop thinking like a soldier. One must think like terrain. This statement was recorded in a notebook and underlined twice. In that moment, understanding arrived about what had been fundamentally wrong all along. The Americans had not been trying to vanish. They had been trying to win. The Australians were not trying to win. They were trying not to be there at all. In reconnaissance operations, that represented the ultimate form of success. The exfiltration proceeded quietly. No dramatic moments occurred, no extraction under fire, no gunship support. Just a silent rendezvous, a quick lift, and 5 Australian silhouettes fading back into the trees before rotor blades kicked up dust. They offered no waves. They conducted no debrief. None was necessary. The mission had changed those that departed from it. Back at the forward base, the usual post-operation conversation was notably subdued. No one boasted about close calls. No one relived heroic moments. Instead, gear was unpacked more slowly than usual. Personnel sat longer during the after-action brief. A weight filled the room, not shame, but reflection. The real takeaway from that joint patrol was not what the SAS accomplished, but what they refrained from doing. No wasteful movement, no unnecessary speech, no dependency on technology, no ego. Comprehensive rethinking began. The team reduced gear weight by approximately 1/3. Radios became fallback tools rather than lifelines. Patrol zones were mapped with terrain considerations in mind, with routes following natural cover rather than simply the shortest paths. One team member, a former college wrestler, began practicing stillness drills, lying motionless in brush for hours, with eyes open and breathing through his nose, training his body to disappear into the jungle. Movement patterns were rehearsed like choreography: when to stop, how to halt silently, how to use visual markers instead of whispers. The focus shifted to moving slower, waiting longer, and most importantly, breaking the American instinct that action equals success. One of the most significant shifts occurred during an operation 2 weeks later. Intelligence indicated a small NVA radio relay site positioned along the Laotian border. Previous methods would have involved a night insertion, rapid advance, site confirmation, and exfiltration under potential contact. Instead, a different approach was attempted. Movement occurred low and slow, with extra time devoted to establishing observation posts, employing scent discipline and terrain masking, just as the Australians had demonstrated. The team maintained silence for 48 hours, with no communications and no signals. When the time came to confirm the site, positioning was so close that serial numbers could be read on enemy field radios. Not a single shot was fired. That felt like the cleanest victory ever achieved. Word began to spread. Other SOG teams inquired about the methodology. There was no bragging, only honesty. The team stopped trying to act like special forces and started acting as though they were not present. Several SOG operators began requesting attachment to SAS patrols, not to lead or command, but to observe and study. What had been witnessed was not merely a different technique, but a different philosophy entirely. One where survival was earned not through dominance, but through absence. That lesson persisted through all subsequent changes, when missions evolved, when the war shifted, and even years later, when the jungle had long since been left behind. Some ghosts teach how to fight. Others teach how to vanish. Years later, long after the war, an opportunity arose to provide a guest lecture at a training course for special reconnaissance. Fresh candidates in pressed fatigues listened to presentations about deep penetration missions, exfiltration protocols, and operating behind enemy lines. At the conclusion, someone asked about the most important lesson learned in Vietnam. The response came without hesitation. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the absence of presence. The reference was not to MACV-SOG, but to the Australians. Those 5 men in faded bush hats with sunburnt faces did not simply move differently, they thought differently. They were not merely trying to succeed, they were trying to disappear. That shift in mindset changed perspectives on everything: the jungle, the mission, even the enemy. American training emphasized fighting and escaping, striking fast and hard, then vanishing in the noise of controlled chaos. Australian training emphasized not existing at all. They did not wait to be hunted. They designed their presence so perfectly that they left no scent, no sound, no trail, no reason for the enemy to look twice. In a war where detection often meant death, this was not merely strategy. This was survival elevated to an art form. Even their mistakes were quiet. One operation saw an SAS pointman brush a branch that snapped loud enough to cause reflexive flinching. He did not curse or freeze. He simply sank lower into undergrowth, waited 3 full minutes, then resumed as if even acknowledging the error would make it real.